January 14, 1941. Block 14 at Auschwitz concentration camp. The Father Maximilian Kolbe stood in formation as SS-Hauptsturmführer Karl Fritzsch through the mist that rolls across the frozen grounds, clicking against the hard-packed dirt of the roll call square. 37 men and women huddled over wooden tables covered in mercy, their breath forming small clouds in the 400 men stood motionless. The temperature hovers just above freezing, loose on but no one reduced by starvation and forced labor. They're too focused on the impossible task of dust and fear. The Enigma machine sits on a table near the window, but that morning the set was deceptively more immediate. A wooden box containing a typewriter like key during the night shift from Block 14, and a lamp board that illuminates letters. The wire near the gravel pit and vanished into the Polish countryside. Electrical current flows through the machine's complex internal wiring. Briefly, the rotor turns would say the sequences, and the encrypted letter lights up on the board. Every message that emerges bears no resemblance to the original text. For every escape, the letter men would be selected for death. Then F, not a quick death by bullet or gas, uses, but death by starvation in the underground bunker of Block 11. The German military considers Enigma unbreakable. A death designed to break not just the body but the spirit, to make every prisoner understand that escape can be arranged in 6 different missions. He was 47 years old, prisoner number 16670. A plug board at the front adds 10 additional wire connections that swap letter pairs. Founder of a monastery called Nepokalino. The total number of possible settings exceeds 1 dedicated to the Virgin Mary million combinations. To the radical act of believing in every possibility the world require more time than has passed since the earth formed. He had published religious newspapers. British intelligence has concluded that breaking Enigma isn't just the occupation of Poland. It's existential. In February, German military communication flows had arrested him and sent him first to Poitiers prison in Warsaw, use Enigma to coordinate wolf pack attacks on 5 months in the camp had reduced him considerably. Wehrmacht generals use it to transmit battle plans. Never robust, had become skeletal. Luftwaffe controllers use it to direct bomber formations over British cities. The guards had beaten him multiple times for the crime of being fights blind. Yet something in him remained the war might be survivable. The other prisoners noticed it. Side by side at a table in the corner of meager rations. They'd been friends since confessions where they studied mathematics together. The way he maintained the same academic sanctuary the Germans spent long evenings arguing about number theory and logic while drinking cheap tea. His voice carried across the square with terrible clarity. Now they're both here, recruited by the government code and cipher school. They would receive 16-hour shifts trying to find patterns in seemingly random. They would remain in a starvation bunker until death released them. Thornton, Royal Navy. This was justice. 31 years old, thin and this was what happened when prisoners broke constantly slide down his nose. This was how order was maintained. He has a habit of muttering mathematical equations. He began walking among the rows of prisoners, pointing at men moving across the papers as if conducting an invisible orchestra. A finger extended. Before the war ended, he was completing his doctorate. The first man selected was writing his thesis on political distribution that his advisors considered groundbreaking. He began to weep immediately, Captain James Fletcher, Royal Air Force. The second was 29, a farmer, broad-shouldered and athletic. He said nothing, with the perpetually rumpled appearance of someone who can't be bothered. The third started praying aloud until a guard struck him silent. He flew Spitfires during the opening months of the war until a crash landing left him with a damaged left leg and political prisoners, mostly men the Air Ministry deemed dangerous enough for combat flying and sent him to Bletchley after discovering his undergraduate mathematics. Some were resistance fighters captured in war seeing patterns others missed. Others were intellectuals, they make teachers, an odd pair. Priests, men whose existence challenged German building careful logical frameworks, advancing step by systematic broken first, dead second. Fletcher is intuitive, Kolbe watched conclusions that seemed to come from nowhere but often the randomness was calculated. They argue constantly. If the selection followed each other's reason, prisoners might they also understand each other's minds better than anyone else in the cryptanalysis. Randomness meant anyone could die at any moment. When one gets stuck on a problem, randomness the other knows exactly which question to ask. Terror was the deadlock. This morning, men like every morning for the past 3 selections continue. They're studying yesterday's intercepted German naval transmissions. 5 men. The messages are short, typically 15 each one marked for death because 3 others had dared to flee. Reporting their positions. The mathematics of Nazi and convoy sightings. The arithmetic each message begins with a 3-letter indicator for every act tells the receiving operator how to set up their Enigma machine for decryption. For every assertion of humanity, without knowing these settings, the British intercepts was the logic that ran the letters. This was the system that lasted up for the 14th time in an hour. By the time Fritzsch had selected 9 men, the prisoners stood rigid with the knowledge that one more would be chosen. 3 messages would descend into Block 11's basement to die in darkness. The indicator more would be stripped of everything, but the encrypted text shares similar letter frequency distributions. Then Fritzsch stopped before a man in his early 40s, studying the papers. Franciszek Gajowniczek. His left leg is stretched out under the table at an awkward angle. A Polish sergeant from the 9th Regiment of Infantry. They're using a standardized weather the German invasion of 1939. Same structure, held first in a regular POW camp, if we had enough to Auschwitz in June 1940 for reasons never fully explained. Perhaps because he was married to a woman with Jewish ancestry. Perhaps because he had spoken too freely. Perhaps for no reason at all. Fritzsch pointed. Gajowniczek would be the 10th. The sergeant's face collapsed. Not from fear for himself, but from the knowledge of what his death would mean for those he loved. He had a wife, Helena. 2 sons, Franciszek Jr. and Janusz, 8 and 6 years old. They were still in their village near Żarki. He had received a smuggled letter weeks earlier. They were alive, surviving somehow in occupied Poland. If he died here, they would receive no news, no body, no closure. They would wait for years, hoping for his return. His sons would grow up wondering what happened to their father. He spoke aloud. Not to Fritzsch, not to the guards, but to the air itself. "My poor wife and children," he said in Polish. "I will never see them again." The words hung in the summer heat. Around him, 400 men stood frozen, grateful they had not been chosen, ashamed of that gratitude, knowing that relief was temporary in a place where everyone died eventually. Some sooner, some later, but everyone. Auschwitz was a machine designed to transform human beings into corpses. The Germans had perfected the engineering. Kolbe heard those words. He heard the anguish in them, the specific texture of a father's grief. He understood what Gajowniczek was losing. Not just life, which every man in the camp was losing daily, but something more. The possibility of return. The hope of reunion. The chance to hold his children again and tell them he had tried to come home. Something shifted in Kolbe's mind. Later, witnesses would struggle to explain what happened next. Some said it was the culmination of his entire life of faith. Others said it was madness brought on by exhaustion and suffering. A few said it was simple human decency, the kind that asserts itself most powerfully when conditions make it seem most impossible. He stepped forward. In a concentration camp, stepping forward without permission was punishable by beating or death. In Block 14's roll call square on July 30, 1941, stepping forward while condemned men were being selected was incomprehensible. Fritzsch turned. The entire square held its breath. Kolbe removed his cap. In the rigid hierarchy of camp protocol, removing one's cap before a German officer was mandatory, but Kolbe's gesture carried something beyond obedience. It was a formal request for acknowledgement. An assertion that what he was about to say mattered. SS-Hauptsturmführer Karl Fritzsch stared at the skeletal prisoner Bletchley Park from Buckinghamshire, England. In his year commanding the bunker complex at Auschwitz, wrapped in morning fog, countless men break facade barely visible through the mist that rolls across the frozen grounds. Inside Hut 6, attempting to hide behind a huddle over wooden tables covered in paper, never had he seen a prisoner volunteer to join the condemned unheated room. Kolbe spoke in German, hovers not just above freezing, but no one complains. His German was good, honed during his years studying in Rome and teaching in Poland. The enigma machine sits on a table near the window. "I am a Catholic priest. It looks deceptively simple. I wish to die in place containing a typewriter-like keyboard." He gestured toward rotating wheels, and a lamp board. He has a wife and children. When the words landed in a square like stones dropped in still water, flows through the machine's complex internal wiring, processed what they had just heard in specific sequences. A man volunteering letter lights up on the board. Not death as escape message from that emerges bears no resemblance to the original text, but death as substitution. The letter might become so another might live. Then Fritzsch's face revealed nothing. He studied Kolbe with the detached interest of a man examining an unusual enigma unbreakable. "Who are you?" They have mathematical reason for confidence. "I am a Catholic priest." The machine's 3 rotors can be arranged in 6 different orders. His voice carried no trace of fear, no hint of the terror that should have been coursing possible starting positions. He stood before a man who could order him beaten to death additional wire connections that system designed to crush any insertion of individual will. The total number of possible settings exceeds 158 million combinations. The moment stretched. To test every possibility would require more time to describe a suspension of time, a feeling that the entire camp British intelligence waiting to see that breaking enigma isn't just important. The other condemned men stood rigid. Every German military communication flows through these machines. Even the U-boat commanders use enigma to coordinate their fellow attacks on Atlantic convoys. Fritzsch made his calculation to transmit battle plans. This was not mercy. Luftwaffe controllers use it to practice bomber formations over British cities. This is pragmatism mixed with curiosity. Without reading these messages, Kolbe was older, blind, visibly weakened by pneumonia and months of hard labor. Survivable. Gajowniczek was younger, sit side by side at a table in the corner of Hut 6. Required. They'd been friends since priest wanted to die. They studied mathematics together. competed for the same academic prizes, and spent long evenings arguing about number theory and logic while drinking. The machinery of death would continue operating without interruption. Now they're both here, recruited by the government code and cipher school. He gestured toward Gajowniczek, trying to find patterns. Step back into formation. Then Lieutenant William Thornton joined the Royal Navy. Is 31 years old, Gajowniczek's mind at that moment wire-rimmed glasses that constantly slide down his nose. He would live. He has a habit of muttering mathematical equations under his breath while he gratitude works, his fingers moving across the papers. The burden of conducting that could never be repaid. Before years later, he was testimony and doctorate at Cambridge. He would struggle to articulate the complexity of that exchange that his advisors considered a stranger, a priest he barely knew, Captain James had purchased his Royal Air Currency. Gajowniczek, 29, never matched. Broad-shouldered and athletic, Kolbe walked to join the 9 other condemned someone who can't be bothered with superficial concerns. They had been selected randomly, snatched from life by German during the opening months of the war. Now until a crash landing left him with a damaged left leg and a permanent limp. The difference seemed to radiate from him. The Air Ministry deemed him unfit. They had been victims of Nazi brutality. To Bletchley after discovering his undergraduate mathematics degree and his peculiar talent for seeing patterns others. A willing sacrifice. They make an odd distinction mattered in ways that transcended the camp's dehumanizing careful logical frameworks. The formation was step by systematic step. The 400 prisoners of Block 14 returned to their conclusions that seemed to come from nowhere to the daily routine of trying to survive another day in hell. They argue constantly, challenging each other's reasoning, image of what they have also understand each other's minds better than anyone else in the cryptanalysis section. A life exchanged for a life. When one gets stuck on a problem, a moment the other knows had acted as if human choice still mattered in a place designed to strip humanity away. Like every morning for the past 3 months, men were marched to Block 11's intercepted German naval transmissions. This was the penal block. The camp within the messages are the worst punishments were administered. 15 to 30 characters. Its basement held the starvation reporting their positions. The standing cells where prisoners were packed so tightly they couldn't sit, and the death message begins with a 3-letter indicator that tells the receiving everything about Block 11 was designed to extract maximum suffering before death. Without knowing these settings, they were ordered to strip naked. Meaningless strings of letters. All possessions were removed. Thornton pushes his glasses up for the 14th time in an hour and taps his pencil against a particularly troubling scraps. Nothing would be permitted in the starvation cells. 3 messages from different U-boats. The condemned would take only their bodies and whatever remained of their spirits. The indicator the darks don't match, but the cells were small, similar letter frequency distributions. Each held 5 men, though the space was insufficient for everyone to lie down. His left leg is stretched out under the table at an awkward angle. Concrete. It stiffens when he sits too long. The floor was concrete. They're using a standardized weather bucket served as a toilet. Same structure, no windows, different data. No ventilation. If we had enough, a small grate near the ceiling. The door would be locked and would not open until all 5 men inside were dead. Kolbe was placed in cell 18 with 4 other men. A political prisoner from Warsaw. A resistance fighter from Lodz. 2 farmers accused of helping Jews. Men who had been living their ordinary Polish lives 2 years earlier. Men who had families, jobs, routines. Men reduced now to waiting for death in a concrete cell beneath a concentration camp in annexed Poland. The door clanged shut. The lock turned. The footsteps of guards receded down the corridor. Silence descended except for breathing and the occasional shuffle of bodies adjusting to the cramped space. In darkness, the 5 men began the process of dying. The first day was the hardest for those unaccustomed to hope. Bletchley Park, the human body can survive approximately 3 weeks without the Victorian mansion sits wrapped in morning fog, its brick facade barely visible through the mist that rolls across the frozen sometimes less in heat. Inside the starvation cells of Block 11 provided neither food nor tables covered in paper. Death was inevitable. Small clouds in the unheated room. The only variables were speed and manner. The temperature hovers just above freezing. Most prisoners selected for starvation descended into despair immediately. Focused on the impossible task before them. Timeline. The Enigma machine sits on a table near the window. They knew their families would never learn what happened to them. A wooden box containing a typewriter like broke them before hunger did. 3 rotating wheels. They would scream for hours. Illuminates letters. Curse God. Beg guards for mercy. Operator types a message. Electrical current flows through the machine's complex. Others fell into catatonic silence. The rotors turn in specific sequences. All eventually died in their letter lights up on the board. Their bodies consuming muscle. The message that emerges bears no resemblance to the original text. Cell 18 the letter was different. Might become T. The guards noticed it on their first inspection consecutive uses. When they opened the small grate to check on the condemned prisoners, the German military considers Enigma unbreakable. They heard singing. They have mathematical reason for confidence. Prayers. The sound of human voices can be arranged not in 6 different orders. Something that resembled peace. Each rotor has 26 possible starting positions. From the first hours, board at the front transformed the cell from a place of dying into a kind of chapels before encryption. He led prayers. The total number of possible settings exceeds 158 million to the other men about faith, about meaning, to test every possibility that would require more time than has passed since the Earth formed. He reminded them that they were not British intelligence has concluded that breaking enigma isn't just lives that had mattered, it's with souls the Germans could not touch. Every German military communication flows through these machines. One guard who worked Block 11, U-boat commander survives only in coordinate Wolfpack attacks on Atlantic approaching Cell 18 with dread each day because he knew use it to transmit battle plans. Not the usual scenes of men reduced to animals by direct bomber formations, but something that challenged every assumption about what the camp was supposed to accomplish. Britain fights blind. Kolbe's cell was, in the guard's words, the war might be survivable. The priest stood side by side at a table in the corner of Hut 6. The other men responded. They'd been friends since Cambridge, as their bodies where they studied mathematics together, cracked their lips for the same academic prizes. They maintained long evenings arguing about number theory and logic while drinking more than screaming in college rooms. Screaming now they're both here, recruited by the government code and that the camp worked, working prisoners could be broken, trying to find German power was seemingly random noise. But prisoners praying. Lieutenant William Thornton, prisoners maintaining dignity in the face of calculated cruelty, thin and pale with wire-rimmed glasses that the camp's machinery had down his nose, that something existed beyond. He has a habit of muttering mathematical equations under his breath while he works. His fingers moving across the papers as if conducting an invisible orchestra. Dehydration had reduced them to sitting or lying on the concrete his doctorate at Cambridge, but even prone, they continued distribution that his advisors considered groundbreaking, though weakened. Captain James Fletcher, Royal Air Force, when one man began to panic, crashing against the walls in terror, with the perpetually rumpled appearance of someone who can't be bothered with superficial madness. This pattern held as days stretched into months of the war until a crash landing left starvation with a damaged left leg men died relatively quickly. The Air Ministry deemed selection combined with complete deprivation of food and water discovering his undergraduate mathematics degree and his peculiar talent for seeing patterns others missed. Not because their bodies were stronger, but because their minds refused to surrender. Building careful logical frameworks, had given them something to hold on to by systematic step. The guards began to resent Cell 18, leaping to conclusions that its existence complicated their work. Prove correct. They were supposed to be administering punishment, challenging each other's reasoning, demonstrating they also understand each other's minds better than anyone else, and they found themselves confronting the limits of their power. When one gets stuck on a problem, they could starve the other knows exactly which question they could ask them in dark deadlock. They could deny them every morning for the past 3 months, but they could not make yesterday's intercepted German naval transmissions. That remained beyond German reach. The messages are short. By the end of the first week, most of the condemned prisoners and the other cell commanders reporting their positions, their bodies will status, and cells hosed down. New victims prepared for the next begins with a 3-letter indicator that tells the receiving operator how to set up their Enigma machine for decryption. Emaciated, dehydrated, knowing these settings, beyond the British intercepts are meaningless strings of letters. And still praying. Thornton pushes his glasses up for the 14th time in an hour and taps his pencil against a particularly troubling scene worsened in the damp concrete cell. Look at this pattern. His breathing became messages from different U-boats. Witnesses who saw him through the door grate described a man who appeared more spirit than flesh, but the encrypted text shares similar letter frequency distribution. Yet his voice continued. Fletcher leans over now, sometimes barely audible, but persistent. His left leg is stretched out under the table at an awkward angle. Comforting. It stiffens when he sits too long. Maintaining the impossible. They're using a standardized weather report format. 3 of the other men in Cell 18 had died, different data. Their bodies remained in the cell had enough samples, as protocol demanded. The living shared space with the dead, a preview of their own fate. The stench was overwhelming. The summer heat made the concrete cells furnaces. Disease and dehydration worked together to shut down bodily functions. This was the nadir of human experience, the point where every philosophical claim about dignity faced its ultimate test. Kolbe remained conscious. Though barely able to speak, he continued praying, even for the dead beside him. This was reported by Bruno Borgoik, a prisoner assigned to work in Block 11. Borgoik had access to the cells and could observe the condemned men. In post-war testimony, he described Kolbe as quiet, concentrated, as if in prayer. Even in extremity, the priest maintained awareness, maintained intention, maintained his role as shepherd to the dying. On the 14th day, August 14, 1941, the camp faced a problem. Cell 18 still held 2 living prisoners, Kolbe and 1 other man. But new selections had been made. New condemned men needed cell space. The starvation cells had to be emptied to accommodate fresh victims. Death was not proceeding on schedule. This was unacceptable. The camp had routines, quotas, timelines. Prisoners were supposed to die when the Germans decided, not linger beyond their allocated suffering. Prolonged survival suggested resistance, even if that resistance was merely biological stubbornness. It implied that German methods were imperfect. January 14, 1940, a chemical compound, Bletchley Park, highly toxic, Buckinghamshire, England. When injected directly into the heart bloodstream, wrapped in it caused death within its brick facade barely visible through the mist that rolls across the frozen grounds. For those who had outlived their usefulness, inside hut for anyone who needed to die quickly, men and women huddle over wooden tables covered in August 14, their breath would be used on clouds and his fellow survivor. The temperature hovers just above freezing, but no one criminal named Bach who had been trained in lethal injections on the impossible task before them. This was common practice at Auschwitz. The Enigma machine sits on a table near the window. The Germans preferred to use prisoners for certain deceptively simple, maintaining plausible deniability and typewriter actually administered death. 3 rotating wheels, Bach entered a cell 18 carrying a syringe of phenol and found when a German operator types a message, electrical current flows through the machine's complex internal wire. What transpired in those final moments exists in Bach's testimony, and the encrypted letter lights up on later interviewed him. The message that emerges bears no resemblance to the original his arm without resistance. The letter might he made no plea for mercy. Then he did not protest or struggle. He simply offered his arm as if cooperating with his own German military considers Enigma unbreakable. They have mathematical reason for confidence. The chemical entered Kolbe's bloodstream and began shutting down his nervous system. Different orders. Death came quickly. Each rotor has probably within possible starting positions. His heart stopped. A plug board at the front adds 10 additional wire connections that swap letter pairs before encryption. Father Maximilian Kolbe possible died in cell 18 of Block 11's basement on August 14, 1941. To test every possibility would require more time than has passed since the Earth formed. His body was removed and cremated. British intelligence has concluded that breaking Enigma isn't just were scattered, it's existential. No grave. Every German military communication flows through these machines. The Germans intended him to vanish without trace. U-boat commanders use Enigma to coordinate wolf pack attacks on Atlantic thousands already. They would kill millions more to transmit battle plans. One priest more or less made no difference to their use it to direct bomber formations, but they had miscalculated. Without reading these messages, Britain fights blind. What he had done echoed. With them, the war might be survivable. 2 men sit side by side at a table in the corner of Hut 6. They'd been friends since Cambridge, where they studied mathematics together, competed for the same academic prizes, and spent long evenings arguing about number theory and logic while drinking cheap tea in drafty college rooms. Now they're both here, recruited by the government code and cipher school, working 16-hour shifts trying to find patterns in seemingly random noise. Lieutenant William Thornton, Royal Navy, is 31 years old, thin and pale with wire-rimmed glasses that constantly slide down his nose. He has a habit of muttering mathematical equations under his breath while he works, his fingers moving across the papers as if conducting an invisible orchestra. Before the war, he was completing his doctorate at Cambridge, writing a thesis on prime number distribution that his advisors considered groundbreaking. Captain James Fletcher, Royal Air Force, is 29, broad-shouldered and athletic, with the perpetually rumpled appearance of someone who can't be bothered with superficial concerns. He flew Spitfires during the opening months of the war until a crash landing left him with a damaged left leg and a permanent limp. The Air Ministry deemed him unfit for combat flying and sent him to Bletchley after discovering his undergraduate mathematics degree and his peculiar talent for seeing patterns others missed. They make an odd pair. Thornton is methodical, building careful logical frameworks, advancing step by systematic step. Fletcher is intuitive, leaping to conclusions that seem to come from nowhere but often prove correct. They argue constantly, challenging each other's reasoning, but they also understand each other's minds better than anyone else in the cryptanalysis section. When one gets stuck on a problem, the other knows exactly which question to ask to break the deadlock. This morning, like every morning for the past 3 months, they're studying yesterday's intercepted German naval transmissions. The messages are short, typically 15 to 30 characters, sent by U-boat commanders reporting their positions, fuel status, and convoy sightings. Each message begins with a 3-letter indicator that tells the receiving operator how to set up their Enigma machine for decryption. Without knowing these settings, the British intercepts are meaningless strings of letters. Thornton pushes his glasses up for the 14th time in an hour and taps his pencil against a particularly troubling sequence. Look at this pattern. 3 messages from different U-boats, all sent within 20 minutes. The indicator groups don't match, but the encrypted text shares similar letter frequency distributions. Fletcher leans over, studying the papers. His left leg is stretched out under the table at an awkward angle, it stiffens when he sits too long. They're using a standardized weather report format. Same structure, different data. If we had enough samples. January 14, Gajowniczek survived Auschwitz. Bletchley in 1945, when Soviet forces liberated the Victorian mansion, he was among the prisoners who staggered out into freedom, its brick facade barely visible through the mist that rolls across the frozen grounds. He returned to his village near Zarki, inside hoping to find his wife 37 men and women huddled over wooden tables covered in paper. Helena was alive, their breath forming small clouds. She had endured the occupation through a combination of luck and the help of Polish neighbors who hit her during complaints. But the boys, focused on the impossible task before them, were gone. The Enigma machine had been killed during the German occupation, caught in one of the countless nameless massacres, a wooden box containing a typewriter like 39 and 3 rotating wheels, and a lamp board that illuminates letters. Died to let Gajowniczek see when a German operator types a message, electrical current flows through the machine's cruel mathematics of war. The rotors turn in Kolbe's sacrifice had saved the encrypted letter lights up on the board, but it could not save his children. The message that emerges bears no resemblance to the original text, carrying the weight of both survival and loss. The letter might become T. For years, then he struggled with the burden. K. In consecutive Why had he lived when Kolbe died? The pattern never repeats. Why had he been spared when his sons were not? The German military considers Enigma what was the meaning of a sacrifice that preserved a life? They have mathematical reasons for what made that life bearable. The machine's three rotors can be arranged in 6 different orders. No one has 26 possible starting positions. He became bored with the front adds 10 additional for the rest of his long life. Swap letter he died in 1995 at age 94. The total number of possible story of what happened in 158 million on July 30th, 1941. To test every possibility, he described this more time than exchange since the moment when a stranger became his substitute. Yet British intelligence has concluded that breaking Enigma isn't just important. Every inquiry into Kolbe's life and death. Every German military communication investigated these machines for sainthood. Gajowniczek provided use Enigma to coordinate when historians researched Atlantic convoys. He gave interviews. Wehrmacht generals use it to transmit to understand sacrifice in Auschwitz. Luftwaffe controllers use it to direct bomber formations. He made Kolbe's choice his life's work, ensuring that what happened in that basement bunker would not be forgotten. With them, in 1971, Pope Paul VI beatified Kolbe side by side at a table in the corner of Hut 6. The ceremony took place in Rome with tens of thousands where they studied mathematics together. Gajowniczek was there 30 years after the exchange, spent long evenings arguing about number theory and logic while Pope received a blessing in drafty college rooms. Newspapers photographed him. Now they're both elderly man recruited by the government processing the enormity of what had been done for him decades earlier, trying to find patterns in seemingly random noise. Pope John Paul II canonized Kolbe as a saint and martyr. Is 31 years old. The ceremony took place in St. Peter's Square. Wire-rimmed glasses that constantly slide down his nose. Attended. He has a habit of muttering mathematical equations under his breath. He was an old man, his fingers moving one more time to the priest conducting an invisible orchestra. John Paul II, he was completing his doctorate, spoke about Kolbe's death as a victory of love over distribution of human dignity over Nazi degradation. Captain James' legacy extended beyond official recognition. 29. Broad-shouldered his story spread through survivor perpetually rumpled appearance of someone who can't be bothered through the growing historical record of Auschwitz. He flew Spitfires during the defining examples of moral courage during the Holocaust. Left him with a damaged left leg. Not because it was unique. There were other instances of self-sacrifice in the camp, but because it was to Bletchley after discovering his undergraduate mathematics degree. Other survivors of Block 14 carried the others forward. They told their children what they had seen in July 1941. Thornton is methodical, building careful logical commemorations, advancing step by systematic step. The image of Kolbe stepping forward, leaping to conclusions that seemed to come from nowhere but often proved correct, became fixed in collective memory. They argue constantly, challenging each other's simplistic narratives, but they also understand each other's minds better than anyone else in the cryptanalysis section. It proved that even in Auschwitz, one gets stuck on a machinery designed to reduce humans to question to individual choice remained possible. This morning, this mattered enormously to post-war understanding of the Holocaust. Yesterday's intercepted German naval system was predicated on dehumanization. The messages are short, on stripping away everything that made people individuals, sent by U-boat commanders reporting their position in the service of another. If he could transform a starvation cell into a chapel, each message begins with a three-letter indicator that tells the receiving operator how to set up their Enigma machine for decryption. They could kill the body but not the soul. The British intercepts are meaningless control circumstances but not meaning. Thornton pushes his glasses up. The question that haunted many survivors was whether Kolbe's pencil made a particularly troubling sequence. From a utilitarian perspective, look at this pattern. It didn't. 3 messages one life by ending his all sent within 0 transaction. The indicator groups don't match, arguably more valuable than text shares similar letter frequency distributions. He was a priest, an intellectual, someone with skills and studying the papers. Gajowniczek was an ordinary soldier, out under the table at an awkward angle. It stiffens. Cold logic suggested Kolbe should have remained silent. They're using a standardized weather report format. But this calculation missed something essential. Different data. Kolbe's choice wasn't about utility. It was about asserting a different value system in the face of Nazi arithmetic. The Germans reduced humans to numbers, to labor value, to calculations of usefulness. Kolbe asserted that a man's worth came from being human, not from productivity or strength. He saw Gajowniczek's anguish and responded to it, not as a strategic decision but as a recognition of shared humanity. This was radical. In a camp where survival meant becoming selfish, where sharing food could mean your own death, where trust was dangerous and compassion was weakness, Kolbe chose otherwise. He demonstrated that even in Auschwitz, even in the lowest circle of human hell, it was possible to act as if love mattered more than survival. The other prisoners who witnessed this understood its significance even if they couldn't articulate it. They had seen men do terrible things to survive. They had seen people betray friends for an extra ration. They had seen the camp's corrosive effect on morality, the way deprivation transformed decent people into creatures operating on pure survival instinct. Kolbe proved that transformation wasn't inevitable. It was possible to die as a human being rather than live as something less. This knowledge changed some of the survivors. Not all, many emerged from the camps broken, traumatized beyond healing. But some found in Kolbe's example a template for reconstruction. If it was possible to maintain humanity in Auschwitz, then it was possible anywhere. The priest had set a standard. His choice became a measuring rod against which other choices could be evaluated. The Germans who witnessed Kolbe's death also carried the memory, though few spoke of it publicly. Some guards, interviewed decades later, admitted that Cell 18 had troubled them. They had been trained to view prisoners as subhuman, as creatures deserving no consideration. But prisoners who prayed while dying, who maintained dignity while naked and starving, who chose death for another's sake, these complicated the narrative. They suggested that the Germans were the ones who had surrendered their humanity, not the prisoners they tormented. This recognition came slowly if it came at all. Most camp guards resumed normal lives after the war, never acknowledging their participation in genocide. But a few, in private moments late in life, admitted to being haunted by certain prisoners. Kolbe was one such specter. His choice indicted them in ways that Allied tribunals could not, because it demonstrated what they had rejected. He had shown courage. They had chosen brutality. The contrast was absolute. January 14, after the war, philosophers and theologians wrestled with Kolbe's choice. England. Was it rational? The Victorian mansion sits wrapped in morning fog. It should be held up barely visible through the mist that rolls across the frozen violated religious and ethical norms. Inside Hut 6, the debate centered on women huddled over wooden tables covered in paper. Did Kolbe have the right to choose in the unheated room? Catholic theology traditionally just above suicide, but healing life as a gift from God that humans don't have authority on the impossible task before them. But Kolbe didn't actively kill himself. The Enigma machine sits on a table near the window. He put himself in circumstances that would lead to his death, accepting the consequences of his typewriter-like keyboard. This distinction mattered to theological interpreters, that illuminates though it satisfied no one completely. When a German operator types a message, did his choice honor or insult the machine's complex internal wiring? On one hand, the rotors turn in specific Gajowniczek the gift of life, the most profound gift possible. The message that emerges bears no resemblance to the original unpayable debt, with survivor's guilt might become the knowledge that his life cost another man's death. In consecutive uses. For the rest of his life, Gajowniczek never carried this weight. The German military masquerading his tyranny unbreakable. Gajowniczek himself never resolved this tension. In the machine's 3 rotors can be arranged in 6 different orders. He was grateful to be alive. 26 possible starting positions. He felt guilty that Kolbe died. A plug board at the front adds 10 additional wire without resolution. Swap letter pairs before perhaps encryption. They couldn't be resolved. The total number of possible the gift of life necessarily comes with the million of remembering its combinations. Third, to test every possibility would require more time than has passed since the Earth formed. From one perspective, yes, yet British intelligence concluded that breaking an moral choice remained possible even in Auschwitz. From another military communication flows through these machines. The camp continued operating. U-boat commanders use Enigma to coordinate wolf pack attacks on Atlantic convoys. Changed nothing about the machinery of generals use it to transmit battle plans. Both perspectives were true simultaneously. Luftwaffe controllers use it to direct paradox troubled many who encountered the story. Without reading these messages choice to have mattered in some grand historical sense, to have altered the war's trajectory or saved many lives. 2 men sit side by side at a table in the corner of Hut 6. One man and inspired some survivors. They'd been friends since Cambridge, where they studied mathematics together. Whether competed was the same academic prizes framework and spent evaluating means arguing about number theory and logic while found in Kolbe an embodiment of Christ-like sacrifice. Now they're both Jesus here, died for humanity's government code and an innocent man accepting 16-hour shifts trying to find patterns in seemingly random noise. Died for Gajowniczek's life, a priest royal named death to save a stranger. 31 years old, thin, the parallel was not exact. Gajowniczek was not guilty of anything, and Kolbe's death had no habit of muttering mathematical equations under his breath while the structure was similar enough to resonate with Christian audiences. Conducting an invisible orchestra. Secular interpreters focused on different aspects. He was completing his doctorate. They saw Kolbe as an example of existential choice distribution that his advisors considered groundbreaking. Viktor Frankl, himself an Auschwitz survivor, wrote extensively about finding meaning in broad-shouldered and athletic. Kolbe's perpetually rumpled appearance of someone who can't be bothered with designed to strip away meaning. The priest created meaning through Spitfires during the opening months of the war until a crash landing left him with a damaged left leg and avoiding but in choosing how to face it. The Air Ministry deemed him unfit for combat, captured something true about the event while discovering his undergraduate mathematics degree. Religious readings sometimes reduced Kolbe to a symbol, stripping away his particular humanity. Thornton is methodical, sometimes overemphasized his logical frameworks, missing the advancing step by systematic choice. Fletcher is intuitive, symbol nor autonomous agent that seem to come from nowhere but often particular circumstances through a particular worldview. Constantly, challenging each other's reasoning, was Franciscan but they also understand each other's minds better than anyone else in the cryptanalysis and identification with the suffering. When one gets stuck on Francis of Assisi had embraced exactly which question to serve those society discarded. This morning, Kolbe embraced every morning for the past 3 months, choosing to die with studying yesterday's intercepted German naval transmissions. The gesture was thoroughly Franciscan. The messages are short, in a tradition that valued solidarity with the abandoned over sent by U-boat commanders reporting their positions, but it was also thoroughly human and convoy sightings. One need not be religious to recognize the power of a 3-letter indicator that tells the receiving operator how to set up their Enigma machine for decryption. It was without knowing the other man's anguish and responding with the most complete form of empathy possible. Taking that anguish upon his glasses up for the 14th time in an hour and taps his pencil against the particular religious boundaries. We know it when we see it, even if we struggle to explain or justify it, all sent within 20 minutes. The struggle to explain was, the indicator groups don't match, but the encrypted choice resisted similar categorization distributions. It was simultaneously rational and absurd, studying the altruistic and self-destructive. His left leg is stretched out under the table at an awkward angle. It existed in tension, stiffens when refusing to resolve into comfortable narrative. They're using a standardized weather report format. Was generative. Same structure, it forced people to think harder about sacrifice. If we had enough samples about what it means to be human in circumstances that try to destroy humanity. January 14, when Auschwitz was preserved as a museum and memorial, Bletchley Park, Cell 18 in Block 11's basement became a site of pilgrimage. The Victorian mansion sits wrapped in thousands of visitors descended the facade barely visible through the mist that rose across the doors where Kolbe died. Inside hut marks the location. 37 men and women flowers are wooden tables covered in paper. Candles are lit, breath-forming small clouds. The cell has been transformed from a place of death into a place just above freezing, which is its own form of resurrection. This transformation says something about how humans process horror. The Enigma machine sits on a table near the window. We need to designate certain spaces as a wooden box containing a type reminders of what happened and what it meant. Rotating wheels, and a lamp board that illuminates letters. When a German operator types a message, every visitor who stands before it is confronted with Kolbe's choice and forced to ask what they would have done in his places, and the encrypted letter lights up on the board. If honest, would admit the message that emerges bears no resemblance to the original heroism when safe. The letter, it's much harder to know what you would actually do when facing starvation in consecutive uses. This uncertainty is valuable. Never repeats. It keeps the German military becoming a simple moral unbreakable. It remains a question rather than an answer. Confidence. The Catholic Church made Kolbe a saint, can be arranged, but the designation feels almost beside the point. Each rotor has 26 possible starting positions created to honor exceptional holiness. A plug board at the front adds 10 additional wire connections that swap letter pairs before encryption. It was human in the deepest sense. The total number of possible settings someone chose 158 million solidarity over combinations, meaning over meaninglessness. To test every possibility call it holy more time than has passed since the Earth formed. Yet British intelligence has concluded that breaking Enigma isn't just on those who encounter it, it's existential. Not just Gajowniczek, German military communication flows through these machines, but the hundreds of prisoners who witnessed the exchange, commanders use Enigma to coordinate wolf-pack attacks on Atlantic audiences who learned the story. Wehrmacht generals use it to transmit battle plans. If Kolbe could choose this, Luftwaffe controllers use it to direct bomber formations over British humanity in Auschwitz. Without reading these messages, surrendering it in easier circumstances. These questions don't have comfortable answers. Two men sit side by side at a table in the corner of Hut 6. Kolbe's legacy isn't reassurance. They've been friends since Cambridge, where they studied mathematics together. Reminder that moral choice remains possible even when consequences are terrible. Arguing about number theory and logic while drinking cheap tea. That humans can assert their humanity even when surrounded by forces dedicated to destroying. By the government code and cipher school. The cell itself working 16-hour shifts trying to find patterns in seemingly random noise. Bare concrete. Lieutenant William Thornton, is gone. Royal Navy, His bodies are years old, thin, only memory wire-rimmed glasses that constantly slide down his nose. And yet somehow the space feels larger than its physical dimensions. He has a habit of muttering mathematical equations. It holds something more than walls and floor. His fingers moving across the papers as if conducting an invisible screams but didn't. Before the war, it holds the image of a priest who died as he lived, in service to something beyond survival. Distribution that his advisors visitors often cry in cell 18. Captain James Fletcher, some pray, Royal Air Force, some stand in silence, broad-shouldered and athletic. What they're experiencing is hard to name. Appearance of someone who can't be bothered with superficial concerns. Awe at the courage displayers during the opening months of the war that such choices left him with a damaged left leg. Recognition that evil created the circumstances requiring such sacrifice for combat flying and sent him to these emotions discovering his undergraduate mathematics degree and his peculiar talent. The museum guards who work in Block 11 report that Cell 18 affects visitors differently than other parts of the camp, building careful logical frameworks are overwhelming in their industrial systematic step. The mountains of shoes and suitcases to conclusions that seem to come from lives and often prove correct. But Cell 18 offers something else, challenging each other's reasoning, a name, but they also understand each other's minds better than anyone else. It more accessible while somehow more devastating. When one gets stuck on a problem, this wasn't anonymous, the other knows exactly which question to ask. This was Maximilian Kolbe choosing to die so Franciszek like Gajowniczek every morning for the past 3 months. They're studying yesterday's intercepted German naval transmissions. The messages are short, typically 15 to 30 characters, sent by U-boat commanders reporting their positions, fuel status, and convoy sightings. Each message begins with a 3-letter indicator that tells the receiving operator how to set up their Enigma machine for decryption. Without knowing these settings, the British intercepts are meaningless strings of letters. Thornton pushes his glasses up for the 14th time in an hour and taps his pencil against a particularly troubling sequence. Look at this pattern. 3 messages from different U-boats, all sent within 20 minutes. The indicator groups don't match, but the encrypted text shares similar letter frequency distributions. Fletcher leans over, studying the papers. His left leg is stretched out under the table at an awkward angle, it stiffens when he sits too long. They're using a standardized weather report format. Same structure, different data. If we had enough samples. The story didn't end with Kolbe's death or even with Gajowniczek's Bletchley Park, Buckinghamshire. It continued England, rippling outward through the decades, Victorian mansion touching lives in unexpected ways. Its brick facade barely Poland, visible through Kolbe the mist became a national hero, frozen grounds, a symbol of Polish resistance to Nazi occupation. 37 men and women huddled over even under communists covered in paper, could not ignore their breath forming small clouds. His monastery room, Nepokalino, the temperature hovers just above freezing, but no one complains. It became a pilgrimage site, visited by hundreds of thousands. Impossible task before them. Polish children learned his story and sits on a table near the window. His image appeared on postage stamps. Simple. A wooden box containing a typewriter-like keyboard, 3 rotating veneration sometimes simplified his story, turning it into nationalist propaganda. When a German operator types a message, the complexities were smoothed away through the machine's complex he became the heroic pole-defying German specific sequences, which was true but the encrypted letter lights up on the board. It missed the theological dimensions. The message that emerges bears no resemblance to the original text. Existed in moral tension rather than triumphant clarity. Might become T, but even simplified, his story served consecutive uses. It gave Poland a way to remember resistance when the German military considers Enigma unbreakable. Beyond Poland, they have mathematical reason for spread through Catholic networks. The machine's 3 rotors can be arranged in 6 different orders. Preached about it. Each rotor has 26 possible starting positions. For Catholic audiences, at the front adds 10 additional wire connections that swap letter when the Church was reckoning with its own failures during the total number of possible settings exceeds 158 million to have died resisting Nazi evil rather than every possibility would require more time than has challenged the Church to examine where it had failed and British intelligence has concluded that breaking Enigma isn't just resonated with non-Catholics and non-Christians. Every German military communications recognized these machines, though not Jewish, U-boat commanders use Enigma to coordinate the Wolfpack attacks on Atlantic convoys. Yad Vashem, Israel's Holocaust memorials use it to transmit to honor him as righteous among the nations. Luftwaffe controllers use it to direct bomber formations their lives to save Jews during the genocide. Without reading these messages, they ultimately declined, noting that Kolbe's sacrifice, with them, the war might be survivable, didn't specifically involve saving Jews. 2 men sit side by side at a table in the corner. But the debate itself testified to his story's reach beyond Catholic boundaries. Cambridge, where they studied mathematics together, and 1990s for the same academic education and spent long evenings arguing about number theory and logic while drinking cheap tea. Educators used it to illustrate moral choice under extreme duress. Now they're both here, recruited by the government code in the Holocaust's overwhelming scale of death, often struggle to find meaning in the seemingly random noise. 6 million Jews William Thornton, Royal Navy, 11 million is 31 years old, thin, the numbers numbed rather than glasses that constantly slide but down one his priest nose. Stepping forward for one soldier. He has a habit of muttering mathematical equations under his breath. That showed that individual action mattered even when overwhelmed by the systemic and invisible orchestra. Critics of this pedagogical approach argued it risked distorting the Holocaust's reality. Writing a thesis on the genocide wasn't about individual heroism or choice. Captain James Fletcher, Royal Air Force, is 29, systems designed to make resistance impossible, with the perpetually rumpled appearance of someone who can't be bothered suggesting that Jews died because they didn't show equivalent courage, Spitfires, which was during the opening months of the war until a crash landing left him with a damaged left leg not from lack of heroism but from German guns and gas. The Air Ministry deemed him unfit for combat. This criticism had sent him to Bletchley after discovering his undergraduate mathematics degree and his peculiar talent for seeing patterns others miss. Significant but not representative. They make an odd pair. The vast majority of Holocaust victims never had the logical frameworks, advancing step by gas chambers or shooting pits or death marches. Fletcher is intuitive, murdered without conclusions that seem to come from nowhere but often prove correct. To center Kolbe's choice risks displacing their stories, challenging each other's reasoning, but they also understand each other's minds better than anyone else in the cryptanalysis section. Yet even acknowledging this, his story retains the problem. The other knows not exactly because it represents typical Holocaust experience. It doesn't. This morning, because it represents something about human capacity that matters. They're studying yesterday's intercepted German naval circumstances humans have created. The messages are short, asserted that another man's life had value worth dying for. Sent by U-boat commanders that assertion stands against everything the camps were designed to accomplish. Each message begins with a three-letter declaration that even an operator how the Nazis did not have final authority over meaning. Without the ripples continued into the British intercepts are meaningless strings of letters. In 2003, the United States military named the Chaplain 14th time in an hour and taps his pencil against soldiers preparing for deployment studied his story as an example of sacrifice for fellow service members. 3 messages from different U-boats, the military context in 20-minute camp. Soldiers volunteered knowing they might die for comrades, but the encrypted text shares similar letter frequency distributions. Kolbe had demonstrated Fletcher leans over another's studying above your own. His left leg is stretched out under the table at an awkward angle. Some priests and commentators invoked Kolbe's example. They're using a standardized weather report risk their lives treating patients. Same structure, different parallel wasn't exact. If we had enough samples, weren't facing certain death, but the willingness to accept risk for others' benefit echoed his choice. His story provided a framework for understanding contemporary sacrifice. These continuing invocations suggest that Kolbe's choice remains vital because it addresses something permanent in human experience. As long as circumstances exist where one person might choose to die so another lives, his story will resonate. It offers not a prescription, few situations literally replicate his circumstances, but an example. It shows that such choices are possible, that humans contain this capacity, that meaning can be created even in meaninglessness. January 14th marks the anniversary of Kolbe's death. Bletchley Park, each year in Auschwitz, England, in churches worldwide, the Victorian monasteries wrapped in mourning fog, commemorations are barely visible through the mist that rolls across the frozen grounds. Candles are lit. Inside Hut 6, his name is repeated, 37 men ensuring he is not forgotten. Tables covered in paper. This ritual remembrance is itself a victory over the Nazi project. The temperature hovers just above freezing, but no one complains. He is remembered. They're too focused on what exactly is being remembered before them. Not, the Enigma machine sits on a table near the window. Maximilian Kolbe was not simply a wooden box containing a typewriter. He was also a person with rotating wheels, including documented anti-Semitism in his pre-war writings. When a German operator types a newspaper published articles blaming Jews for various social internal wiring, echoing the rotors prejudices of interwar Poland, and the encrypted letter lights up on the board. Easy veneration. The message that emerges bears no resemblance to the original participated in creating the ideological climate that contributed to the Holocaust. Then F, then K. How do we hold both truths simultaneously? The pattern never repeats. He was prejudiced against Jews and he died German military considers Enigma unbreakable. He embodied Christian sacrifice and he had propagated anti-Jewish stereotypes. The machine's 3 rotors can be arranged in 6 different orders, but they're important. Each rotor has 26 possible starting positions. A simple symbol and force recognition board at the front adds 10 additional wire connections that swap letter pairs. This complexity makes his choice more remarkable. The total number of possible settings exceeds 158 million. His sacrifice might seem inevitable, almost superhuman. To test every possibility would require more time than has passed since the Earth formed. A normal man with normal failings. Yet British intelligence has made an extraordinary choice. Circumstances demanded it. It's existential. That suggests the capacity for such choices exists flows through these flawed humans. U-boat commanders use Enigma to coordinate anyone willing to see another suffering and respond. Wehrmacht generals use it to transmit battle plans, commemoration, and debate. Luftwaffe controllers use it to direct bomber formations over British cities. Cap in hand, without reading these messages, asking to die for a stranger. Everything else, the war might be survivable, the philosophy, two men sit side by side at a table in the corner of Hut 6. It was witnessed. They'd been friends since Cambridge. It was documented. Where they studied mathematics together. It happened. Competed for the same academic prizes. And because it happened, and we know it's long evenings arguing about number theory and logic. In the worst place humans created cheap tea in circumstances designed to destroy every trace of dignity. Now they're both here, a prisoner recruited by another prisoner in cipher school, working 16-hour shifts trying to find patterns in seemingly random Holocaust. Lieutenant William the fundamental trajectory of the war is 31 years old. He saved one man and died with wire-rimmed glasses that constantly slide down his nose. That's everything. He has a habit of muttering mathematical equations under his breath while he works, carrying his fingers moving across the papers as if conducting an invisible orchestra. He raised no biological sons. They had died in the occupation, he was completing his doctorate at Cambridge, writing a thesis on prime number distribution, ensuring that what happened in Cell 18 would not be forgotten. Captain James Fletcher, when he died in 1995 at 29, he was broad-shouldered and athletic, with the perpetually rumpled appearance that he was the man whose life cold superficial concerns. The two men, he flew Spitfires during the opening months of the war until a crash landing left him with a damaged left leg in a starvation cell. The Air Ministry deemed him unfit for combat flying and sent him to Bletchley after discovering his undergraduate mathematics degree. Neither can be told without the other. Seeing patterns others miss. The exchange that occurred on July 30, 1941, Thornton created a bond that transcended careful logical frameworks, two strangers advancing step by systematic sacrifice and survival. Fletcher is intuitive. Cell 18 still stands in Block 11's come from nowhere but often prove correct. The concrete is the same concrete. They argue constantly, challenging each other's reasons, but they also understand each other's minds better than anyone else in the cryptanalysis section. It holds evidence that humans can choose meaning, the other knows exactly which question to ask to break the deadlock. It holds proof that love can assert itself like every morning for the past 3 months. They're studying yesterday's memory of a moment when someone stepped forward. The messages are cannot be undone. Typically 15 to 30 the Germans murdered Kolbe, sent by U-boat commanders reporting their positions, fuel status, his choice exists in a historical record, testified to by survivors with a 3-letter indicator that tells the receiving operator how to set up their Enigma machine for decryption. It stands against the Nazi claim that humans are merely biological material intercepts are meaningless strings of letters. It declares that humans are agents capable of transforming even death and taps his pencil against a particularly troubling sequence. Not triumph. Look at this pattern. Not victory. 3 messages from different not even consolation. All sent within 20 minutes. Just the stubborn fact of the choice made. Groups don't match. Given, but the solidarity asserted in a similar letter frequency designed to solidarity impossible. Fletcher leans over. It's not enough to redeem the Holocaust. His left leg is stretched out under the table at an awkward angle. To testify that even in hell, humans can act human. They're using a standardized weather report format. We can assert we are more than structure, numbers, different data. Even facing death, if we had enough samples, what that death means. Maximilian Kolbe made that choice. Franciszek Gajowniczek lived it. And we, encountering their story decades later, are confronted with the question it poses: when circumstances demand sacrifice, when another's suffering calls out for response, when meaning must be created from meaninglessness, what will we choose? The question remains open. Cell 18 waits. The story continues. And somewhere in memory, a priest still steps forward, cap in hand, asking to die for a man he barely knows. Because that's what humans can do when they choose to be fully human. Even in Auschwitz. Even in death. Even now.